welcome everybody and introducing you to Jane Bianchini and Dr. Joe Lukins.
God, thanks very much, Joanna. Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today on the topic of how to recruit effectively by understanding cognitive bias. And it's certainly a big topic and even more so relevant in today's society. And just for some housekeeping, we have my colleague Joanna, who you just heard from, who'll be assisting us moderate the session and keep an eye on some time and questions coming through either the chat or the Q&A sections. So we'll save some of those questions till the end. We'll finish shortly before the hour is up, just for those who are attending the live event, to give you some space, perhaps before your next meeting. We'll also be recording the session and have also chosen not to give you death by PowerPoint, rather a format that you can listen to, again, without the need to be in front of a computer, and perhaps you might choose to pop your earphones in and take a bit of a walk and listen to the recording again. So let's get into it. So for those of you who are on the webinar and don't know me, my name is Jane Bianchini, and I'm the founder and CEO of Alchemy. And we believe we're more than just a video interviewing platform. Put simply, we help organisations drive objectivity and minimise bias in their recruitment screening practices, and thereby improving the diversity of their workforce for better overall organisational outcomes. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Joe Lukins, who holds a PhD in psychology and has over 25 years experience spending her time in the heads of individuals and teams and organisations to help them reach their potential. And she has recently authored a really great content-rich book called The Elite, Think Like an Athlete, Succeed Like a Champion. And so for one lucky attendee, Joanna will be randomly selecting a winner to receive a free hard copy of that book. Hi, Joe.
Oh, good morning. I was going to say good morning. It's afternoon now, isn't it? Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Just so you know, I'm coming to you from sunny North Queensland, so I'm based up in Townsville. So we've got some beautiful weather up here at the moment, and really, really pleased to be here today and the opportunity to speak with all of you about this really important topic.
Well, it certainly is. And as we know, unconscious bias is often hiding in plain sight in our society, and it's ever present. We see it in the news, and more focus is being put on this in the current economic climate. And of most interest to us, though, in this session today, we find it in the workplace and during the hiring process. And by simply being human, recruiters and managers can fall prey to signals that suggest that the candidate is somehow not like them or not part of their so-called tribe. So Dr. Joe, can I start by asking, actually, what got you into working into the area of bias?
Well, I think it's probably challenging for anyone who works in psychology to not be paying some attention to bias. And I think that probably highlights one of the key points I wanted to start with, is that I know a lot of people worry about the thought that they might have bias. And I think that, that's understandable. Like, it's a bad characteristic that we shouldn't have and we shouldn't admit to. And the reality is you're only ever going to have bias if you ever have to make a decision and if you've got a brain in your head. So that pretty much counts all of us, I think. So I've been really interested through my career to explore bias from lots of different angles. But I think probably my first experience with it was actually as a very freshly graduate. I'd finished my degree here in Townsville, and I went to my very first job interview, and it certainly wasn't an implicit bias that I was on the receiving end of. I did my interview. I thought I'd done rather well, as you do when you're 21 and you're full of optimism, and got the phone call the next day to say that I'd been unsuccessful in the interview. So I sort of got sat on my backside and I hadn't got it, and I asked the obvious question that we're all told that we should ask about, can you give me a bit of feedback as to why it is that I was unsuccessful. And the director of the centre said, well, Joe, really we were looking for an older male who was a social worker, and it would have helped if you were Catholic.
Oh, come on.
There's lots of things that you could obviously say, because I remember at the time being sort of taken aback by it. And I wasn't quite cocky enough at the time to say, well, why did you interview me in the first place then? Because clearly I was none of those things. So I guess I was on the receiving end of quite some overt bias, which is not our focus for today. But I've been interested through my career through lots of different things that we've looked at, and whether it's been, I had an honours student once who looked at, my background is in performance psychology and sports psychology. That's where I started. And one of my students actually looked at, does the colour of your uniform when you're playing sport, and in this case it was basketball, does that make any difference to how aggressive the referee predicts that you are? And
Ooh,
so it was a fascinating study. And so we set up this whole scenario where we had basketball players wearing black uniforms and white uniforms and looking at the perceived levels of aggression depending upon the level of the referee. And very interestingly, the higher end the referee was, as in, you know, the higher standard of basketball they were reffing, and we went all the way through to the national level, the more aggressive they thought they were if they were in a black uniform. So, you know, it's one example, there's many, and I know that's not the focus for today, but I guess humans are fascinating. You know, we do these things, we think we're so logical, we think, you know, everyone else has these biases, but we all have them. You know, in fact, thinking that you don't have a bias is a bias. So I'm really pleased about this conversation that we're going to be having today.
Jo, I just might touch on that ever so slightly, because I think you mentioned in some of our earlier conversations about the colour in the Cowboys change room.
Yes. So as I said, my background is in psychology, so and sports psychology. So if you're a fan of the rugby league, then you'll probably know about the Cowboys. Not going so well for us at the moment, so it's a bit hard in the bubble. So I've been with the club for a very long. I've been with them since 1996. So that you can probably do the numbers on your fingers and work out how old I am. But so back in the stadium in the early days, someone from the club rang me and said, look, Jo, we're about to do some refurbs in the stadium, and we're just curious as to whether psychology can tell us anything about what colour the change room should be. Will that make any impact in terms of preparation or performance? And I hadn't, because part of my role is I don't go into the dressing sheds. That's not where I need to do my work. I need to do my work well before players get to that stage. And I said, what colour is the dressing sheds? And they said, it's apricot. And so it didn't actually take me too long. I hadn't actually looked through all the research on colour, but I just made the suggestion that perhaps they could do it in the club colours. So, which is the blue and the grey, if you know the Cowboys. So we did our change rooms in the blue and the grey, and we did the same thing with the away team dressing sheds as well. And I work with the Townsville Fire, who's in the Women's National Basketball League, and we plastered the fire through both change rooms with pictures and a whole range of things, because it's about defining a space, and you know, in sport it's about making your opposition feel uncomfortable where they are. So it was an interesting time.
Oh, that is very interesting, and it just all the facets of unconscious and implicit biases, as we've just found out, are omnipresent everywhere in our society. Jo, do you have any research or knowledge around where biases actually originate from?
It's a very, very interesting area of exploration, and of course it's a question that we want the answer to. For a long time, bias was thought to sort of develop in those early school years, or the late sort of preschool years, that's when we start to develop it. But what we actually find now through some of the research is it can be as early as 6 or 9 months in a baby, where a baby will show preference, and I use that word very carefully, a baby will show preference for those who are similar, because it's around about that time that babies start to, we talk about attachment theory, and babies often get distressed when their major caregiver, you know, steps out of the room and so forth. And a lot of that is about babies do seem to show preference for people who are like, so whatever it might be, but, you know, obviously some of the obvious visual cues are there, that if you look like me, then that, and that's obviously and particularly it's going to be about that major caregiver. That seems to be one of the key differences. Now, a preference isn't, you know, racism or sexism. It's a preference at that age, but it makes sense then how some of the biases can then continue to develop, particularly if you haven't had a lot of diversity in those very young ages in terms of our development.
So it's more about discriminating for making sure that they're cared for, I guess, and for protection is how they preference for similarity. Absolutely.
And you actually even see that when you look at some of the physiological data, when you look at heart rate data for little ones, you know, as you know, it's less evident when they're 5 months, but when a stranger comes into the space, whatever that stranger might look like, heart rate goes up, not at 5 months, but it tends to by about 8 months. So we think that preferences certainly start to happen quite early. And, you know, and then they can develop through our life experiences, what we're told and so forth, particularly when it comes to some of those overt practices. Jane, can I ask you then, I'm keen to understand why you've chosen to focus in this particular area and within this platform.
That's a really good question. So with video interviewing, Dr. Jo, it's kind of the elephant in the room, and like visually seeing someone's name, watching them answer a question by video, like assessing their appearances, their ethnic background, age, gender, it's just like a hot pot for biases. And that was one of the early criticisms in video interviewing platforms. And one of the first questions we used to get asked, even if I go back some 5 years ago. And so many of our friends in the industry, other video interviewing providers, they jumped straight onto this and they tried to solve this with the use of AI. And as I started to watch this unfold, some of this didn't really quite sit that well with me. And so I just incubated that for a little bit and just started to tease out what the friction was between AI. And it fell out quite naturally that it actually really hindered any efforts to recruit a diverse and inclusive workforce. And so we stopped our own experimentation in this regard, and then we looked at ways in which we could add value to help evaluators minimise their biases at that video interviewing stage and make the process more inclusive for candidates with diverse or neurodiverse needs as well. Look, we're not against AI, I'll just make that comment there. However, we have kind of landed on the position that that's more suited at the top of the funnel in the screening section of the recruitment process, as opposed to the bottom of the screening funnel, which is where we see video interviewing sit. So it's been a fascinating journey, I have to admit. But what we are seeing, Dr. Jo, is employees being trained in unconscious biases in the workplace, yet very little attention is given to unconscious or implicit biases when we teach new recruiters or evaluators or hiring managers on how to screen on new candidates coming through or on being able to interview objectively. And I'm not seeing a great deal of focus on, and I could be wrong, and I'd be very happy to be shot down and I'd love to see some examples of this, but I'm not seeing a lot of evidence in the marketplace where we're looking at the learning on the way we think, thinking about the way we think. And so philosophically, it's rare that we feel comfortable challenging people on the way they think versus the views that they hold. And so I've been kind of sitting with that for a bit. And Dr. Jo, I know that you've done some work with the Australian Defence Force on implicit bias. And are you seeing anything in particular in that field?
Yeah, it's certainly it's a new area, and like you say, it's not one that. And again, my understanding would be there hasn't been a lot of attention in that either. That whole, the metacognitions. How do we think about how we think? And I mentioned at the start of the call for anyone who's come in a little bit later that I'm based up here in Paradise, up in sunny Townsville. It's winter at the moment, so we call it Paradise. We don't call it Paradise in summer when it's hot. But then we stay in air conditioning. But anyway, but for those who are familiar with Townsville will know that we have a very large defence base up here. And I've been very fortunate. My work is as a civilian. I have links with the university and so forth. But I've actually had the opportunity in the last, I think it's probably about the last 6 years now, that I've been working out in the High Performance Centre out there with soldiers across a whole range of different areas and units and expertise, and then some of that work's extended out through the country. One of the things that I've been really encouraged by, because of course going into defence settings it's a very privileged space to be in that not everyone gets to see. So I've been really grateful as a Townsville resident who was, we were all saved by our soldiers when the floods came through and so forth. To be able to go back and do some work with them has been fantastic. One of the things I've been particularly impressed with has been that recognition and acceptance that bias is a part of who we are and what we do. And obviously when you're looking at something like defence, and particularly decisions that get made in defence can be life and death. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're heading into those decisions trying as best you can to not only be mindful of the biases, but then trying to either push them to one side or exclude them or deal with them as you're making decisions. And of course, if you end up in a space where everyone is same, you know, everyone's similar age, similar background, all their training's the same and so forth, you're really prone to that sort of groupthink mentality. So certainly in the work I've been doing, that exploration has been there about, you know, what is implicit bias, or sometimes referred to as unconscious bias, what does that even look like, and how does that affect our decision making? And even some of the exercises that we do through the training there's one in particular, it's a bit lengthy so I won't go into the details, but it's exploring gender bias, which is probably what people think we're going to head to first of all, but there's, I mean, as we've said, bias is everywhere, from uniform colours to everything else. But this is a particular example, and I mention it because every time I demonstrate the test, and every time I show it to the soldiers first, with me doing it before they do it, and every time I show that I'm you know, vulnerable to the bias against women, and that horrifies me, because as someone who's advocated for opportunities for women all my career, I just go, oh, so it's something I'm really mindful of it, and I think it kind of helps them to go, wow, if that's happening for her, then it could be happening for us. And so then we all come from a place of bias is part of what's in our lives. So the more we can learn to understand about it, then we can do something about it.
Yeah,
and helps our decision making with it. So,
and that's, I guess, the crux really of unconscious biases in the recruitment process, because at each point, even at sub-second junctures of listening to candidates, we're having to make decisions, and that's where that's the house of where unconscious biases are formed, is looking at people through your own lens with all of your preconceived biases and experiences, and as we talked about earlier, the way you've grown up and what you would distinguish between what's right and wrong, and that's what we're, you know, really going to try and get into the heart of. Dr. Jo, can we actually measure implicit bias?
Well, it's certainly something that's been explored for quite some time. So the first main measure that we saw come onto the scene, it was actually back in 1998. The acronym for it is the IAT. It's the implicit perception test and association test. And it's a really interesting instrument, because what it tries to do is to measure the strength of associations between different concepts. So it might look at particular types of people, if we want to categorise people as types of peoples, or evaluations around good and bad, or stereotypes, you know, you're athletic or you're clumsy or whatever it is. And the assumption that goes behind it is that when we see things that are relatively similar, we respond to those more quickly. So it's certainly been a measure that's been around for a while. Now, with all measures, and particularly any measures that have to do with the brain, we have to be a little bit cautious with them. So it's a measure that has merit, and it's certainly, when we're looking at it at a broader audience, it has some useful things that it can say to us. That being said, you could do it today and get one result, do it tomorrow and get a different one. So I say with all psychometric testing, you know, that you want to show some level of caution when you're looking at results, and certainly don't make it a hard, fast, prescriptive conclusion that you might make about it. But certainly as an instrument, it's an interesting one, and I think it's an interesting one to take ourselves through. But I know, Jane, we were speaking in the lead up to this presentation, and I know you've actually had a really interesting interview with someone who's been looking at this. So could you share a little bit with us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was with someone by the name of Siddharth Shrodkar, who's a PhD candidate at ANU University, and some of his research came into the mainstream media some months ago. And so I sought him out, and we had a fascinating chat, and then invited him to join me on a video webinar interview. So for people on the call, I'll share the link to that in the follow-up notes. But his research was quite interesting in that he found 3 in 4 Australians showed, or 75% showed bias against Indigenous Australians. And that was, he had looked at over 11,000 responses collected over 10 years. And before I actually had the pleasure of spending some time with Siddharth I'd actually taken the implicit association test myself, and as someone who is keenly interested in biases, I know I'm going to absolutely, you know, come out that I've got, you know, a clean lens. Well, no, I didn't. And when I was asking Siddharth about this, he said that of the 11,000 responses, there was not one single person that was neutral. So there are implicit biases in everyone. And whilst I agree with you, taking psychometric assessments, at least in my studies, and I'm nowhere near anywhere being a qualified psychologist as you, Dr. Joe, but I, in my recruitment days, was taught that an assessment such as this maybe should only be taken into account maybe around that 20% mark. But it'd be worthwhile for people taking the opportunity to go and have a look at the implicit association test and make that a bit of fun with your hiring managers and other evaluators, just to maybe just free up the conversation a little bit to say, look, everyone has them. It's okay. It's not a taboo subject. If you have them, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that you're open to the experience of trying to call them out, so that you're looking and assessing candidates with a cleaner lens than perhaps you did before you started to bring those biases to the fore.
Yeah, and I would definitely reinforce what you're saying there, Jane, that I think that what these kind of instruments do is they start a conversation as well. So, you know, oh, how did you go when you did that bit, or how did you find it? And I think that that's one of the merits of these kind of tools. And as long as you don't, like you said, get too, you know, you wouldn't make a recruitment decision based on them, but you know, but as a tool, and particularly as a professional development activity, I think they're really useful. And I think it would be great, Jane. I'd love to know now, as we turn the lens to the sort of the recruitment process itself, how can we mitigate some of the biases that we see in recruitment?
It's a big question. Look, what I start to see some organisations do is really embrace this concept with vigour and diving straight in. I've seen that some organisations will actually start to map where the implicit biases are most likely to derail the outcomes of the process that you're looking to achieve, right? And so that might be calling out where implicit biases might sit during your pre-screening briefing, baking them into the evaluation guides. And then also what we're seeing is some of our clients using our platform to help educate the evaluators on biases with the use of our independent collaboration setup. So for instance, Dr. Joe, if you and I were on the evaluation panel, I wouldn't be able to see your responses and you wouldn't be able to see mine. And then if we were just to take that as a starting point, which is great because as we talked about earlier, that minimises any level of groupthink. And also as you're evaluating each applicant, knowing that your results are going to be shown with other evaluators, you're probably going to be evaluating with a little bit more objectivity and keenness in your eye than perhaps if it was just a once-off screen and you weren't being held to account for your decision. And so this notion of creating a safe-to-fail experiment within our platform post-hire, where some, as I said, some companies are using a combination of some of the levers in our platform to tease out some of those evaluator biases. So, for instance, hiding the candidate's name and or disguising their voice or hiding their video, and seeing if the same candidates would be selected or bubble to the top of the pile when assessing candidates through different lenses. That's what we're saying. So yeah, and I guess some of our clients are looking to further dig a little bit deeper into that by something that's become quite popular now globally in the pursuit of ensuring that we've got a diverse and inclusive workforce, which starts at the screening phase, is to have, as I said, multiple people on a recruitment panel. So if they're looking at, if organisations are looking at potential candidates coming to their organisation, ensuring or mandating, I guess, for diverse, rich evaluation panels with a good number is 3 people on an evaluation panel, so that you can see that through multiple lenses. And then, as we mentioned, testing their own implicit biases, perhaps with the use of a tool. There are others out there, but such as the IAT test. And then we also have the ability to help to allow candidates to deliver written responses to either a video or a passage of text question. And so with the different levers in our platform, we have the ability to perhaps serve up to the hiring manager the candidate's written response without the name of the person. So that's really useful for, say, internal mobility to minimise any biases around familiarity with a colleague. So the example I sometimes use is if Sally from accounts has just finished a marketing degree and wants to go and work in the marketing department, but Simon's been in the marketing department for 3 years. Simon and Sally are applying to the role. The marketing manager looks at their written responses. Now, without their names and just assessing on merit of what the candidates have written, we'll be able to make a fairer judgment without the lens of, okay, well, that's Simon and I've got all of the interference and knowledge I have about Simon and I know nothing about Sally. Will perhaps increase that level of objectivity in that manager's screening process. So that's kind of, where we kind of land on all of that. So Dr. Joe, before we open the floor to questions, in your experience, what additional strategies would you recommend HR or talent acquisition teams and organisations generally to consider in overcoming some biases in recruitment?
Maybe sorry, I muted myself before. There was a helicopter coming overhead, so sorry, I just unmuted my apologies for that. I think that there's lots of opportunities to start having conversations about bias in workplaces, and I think it's good for organisations to do it across their organisations as well, because essentially wherever decisions are being made, there's the potential there for bias, and particularly even if you're an organisation that has some sort of product or you're working out a line or whatever it is, there's the potential there to be looking around the room, seeing who's in there, if everyone looks the same, if they're all around the same age, all those sorts of things. And it's starting to suggest to you that perhaps you haven't got that diversity there. And Jane, I've been trying to remember, I know you and I were talking about some of the figures that we've seen about kind of the financial bottom line about the impact. And I might ask you in a moment, because I know you're much better at remembering those numbers than I am. But I'll just put you on the spot there. That'll give you 30 seconds to think about it while I keep talking. Yeah. But I think what I recommend to organisations is to first of all to acknowledge and to accept that it's an okay part of organisations that these biases are there, but then to explore it. And I do think looking around the room, looking at what the makeup is within your organisation of people in terms of experiences and so forth, and those who are watching have perhaps seen some of those sort of milestone studies that we've seen, that you're more likely to be a CEO if you're male and you're over 6 foot. Yeah. There's all sorts of things, and you mentioned before about, I think you said Sally and Simon on the applications, and we know that, I know you just picked out some names there, but we do even make assumptions about names and so forth. And there's plenty of research that says that, like you said, I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about your platform, because, you put the same application in, but put different names on it, and people have very different responses to it. Because as humans, we think that on average, humans make about 30 to 40,000 decisions every single day. So it's no wonder that by the end of the day, we're all exhausted. So that's what's happening. And the only way our poor little brain can cope with all of that is we condense stuff down. Like, if we know stuff, then we don't have to think about it. So it's from everything from, and this is not a bias, but this is an example of a habitual behaviour. Every time I get into my car, it's the same routine in terms of getting in, throwing my bag in the seat, putting the seatbelt on, adjusting the music, adjusting the mirrors, turning up the aircon because I'm in North Queensland, and off I go. Yeah. Now, there were lots of decisions in that process that required no brain power because I just do it all the time. So as humans, we're constantly seeking every single moment of the day to do things on autopilot. So as I said before, if we're making 30 to 40,000 decisions every day, and it's approximated that around 40% of our everyday is habit, well, then the recruitment process can become habit if we're not careful. We can do it the same way. We can sit in the same seats. We can look at the applications in the same way. And I think that curiosity question of, how could we do this differently, or what's happening here, what are we looking at in terms of dynamics and so forth. I think constantly asking those questions and having some of those, you know, like what I would do on a panel is I would look at applicants and go, how do I think we're similar, and how could that be getting in the way? Like, I nearly introduced an additional bias into this panel when we came into it, Jane. If you remember the original conversations before, we were talking to Joanna and getting it all up and running, and I had suggested that rather than you and I ask the questions, that we bring a facilitator in. Well, if I can share with those in the audience, the person I thought of wasn't actually available today, but can I tell you that I'm not going to tell you how old Jane is or I am, but she's very close in age to us. It was a female, and her name was Jane. So it's you know, it's instantly like we tend to do these things, and she would have been a great facilitator too. I mean, I think we're doing okay asking each other some questions, but we do tend to lean towards what we know because it saves me from having to think. Yeah. And so I think the short answer to the question that you asked me is that when we pay attention to the decisions that we're making, if we cast a little bit of a lens of it, I sometimes refer to it almost like putting an additional eye up over the conversation and going, ooh, what am I doing here? What am I deciding? What am I thinking about? And then trying to explore that. And maybe what I'm going with is going to be fine, but I need to be aware that I might be subjecting the process to bias without intending it to. And I don't know if I've been here long enough to think about some of those figures. Can you recall what they were?
Yeah, I think the one statistic you might be referring to was the gender diversity report that KPMG had put out, and that by halving the gender pay gap in Australia and reducing the entrenched discrimination against women could deliver something in the order of $60 billion to the Australian economy by 2038. I mean, that's staggering. And, you know, the term that's being used at the moment when looking at staggering numbers is eye-watering. But I mean, just on that metric alone, and just on the biases in gender, if we even start to close that gap, it makes a meaningful difference.
Yeah.
But look, just to pick up on what you were saying also there's two books that I wouldn't mind introducing to our viewers if they haven't already heard of them, and I'm sure everyone on the call, on the webinar has. But one is a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I'm sure you're across that, Dr. Joe. And the other one is The Intelligence Trap. And so that is a book which looks at, I think the subtitle of that book is why do really intelligent people make dumb decisions, and being careful that we're not falling into any biases when we're looking at different forms of intelligence, whether that be cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, intellectual intelligence. So they're two extra areas that we can explore as well. So I might pause there for a breath and ask Joanna if there are any questions that are coming through.
Yes, there are. So we have a question from Jasmine, and Jasmine asks, can you please confirm the name of the test?
It's the Implicit Association Test, IAT. So if you were to put into your browser IAT or implicit association, you'll find that. You have to do a little bit digging to get to the Australian one. So if that's of use, I'll put that in the resources as well for you to take.
Thank you, Jane. We also have a question for you, and you mentioned written assessments earlier. How do you ensure the person writing the answer is the same person who is applying for the role?
Great. So that's a really good question. So what we do in our platform, you can have any combination of a video question or passages of text question with a video answer or a written response. And so what we're seeing some of our clients use the platform to do is they might serve up some first up questions that might be personality or competency based questions, move into a written work sample exercise, and then shortly after they may pose a video message, not a question, to say, you're about to meet a colleague in the corridor and she's got some questions for you on the report that you've just written. Then the question would go to, Hi, great to see you again. I'm just about to go to a meeting and I know I'm going to be asked about the report that you've just submitted through your work sample. Could you give me a quick 30-second to a minute overview of your thoughts that went into that, into your response? And so by being able to serve up a written response with a verbal response, we're now being able to assess the candidate's written communication and verbal communication skills, and to a lesser extent, perhaps some critical thinking skills as well. But by being able to do that instantly, we can see that we've got both the person who's written the response is the same as the candidate applying for the role.
Thank you, Jane. One more question. Could you please give us an example of organisations doing well in the bias space?
Oh gosh, absolutely. I don't know if I can actually name them by their name because I don't have their permission to share with you what they're doing on this call. But certainly, believe it or not, federal government is doing exceptionally well in this space. We recently won a major federal government tender competitively because of our minimising bias features. With the view that they would be using this right across whole of government and educating their candidate base also to demystify what that process is, knowing that the candidate's experience is transparent and that they'd be using some of these tools to select the right person for the role and for their ability to add culture to that department. There are certainly other organisations in the logistics and transportation industry, which again has some challenges with their recruitment screening outcomes, being a heavily male-dominated industry, and also not necessarily looking at diverse neurodiverse needs. So we've got one example whereby there was a person who was looking for a docking assistant. I can't actually remember the job title, but intentionally looked at using some of the levers in our platform, called out for a merit-based, a reasonable adjustment process whereby they would ask candidates if they had any diverse or neurodiverse needs to call them out. They had some candidates that came through who called it, they had autism, dyslexia, what was the other one? It was Tourette's. And they ended up selecting an autistic person to join them in the dock. And naturally, through that recruitment process, would you believe, the whole workforce started to lean into the person with autism, and it engendered and fostered a very caring and nurturing dock, which of course was a great outcome for that organisation. So, but it's slowly becoming a lot more a topic that is reaching the boardroom table, which is what we're really happy to see. Dr. Jo, do you see any organisations that you work with doing well in this industry, in this area?
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the industries that are really interested to explore this is, and I guess I'm stepping a little bit out of the recruitment and more into sort of practice for clients, is financial services. So I work with quite a few accounting firms who want to educate their clients around implicit bias, because financial advising, and I don't know if people saw, there was a really interesting article specifically around this time of COVID in the Australian, I think probably 2 weeks ago, about the psychology of investing. So the psychology of investing is always prominent, you know, because it triggers off two buttons, which is fear and greed. And typically humans do, you know, you were talking before about smart people doing silly things, you know, and we know that, you know, if in your life you have something go well for you and something go against you, then that pain is much stronger than the actual pleasure, if you like. So we often talk about it in terms of humans having what we call a negativity bias, you know, in terms of we gravitate to the negative. So if you gravitate to the negative and you're doing financial investing, then, you know, those two things don't necessarily come together. So that's probably one of the industries where I've seen a lot of interest around human bias and trying to educate both staff, because, you know, staff are just as prone to them as well. But then when you're educating clients so that they can make those decisions that will be better for them financially. So that's one area that comes straight to mind for me.
Yeah, interesting.
Thank you, Dr. Jo. We do actually have a few more questions if we have a few more minutes. How do we accommodate for people with English as a second language or people with a disability on written tests?
How do we, sorry, just say that again, Jo, Anna?
Yeah, sure. How do we accommodate for people with English as a second language or people with a disability when it comes to written tests?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it would be in the application phase by calling out any asking candidates if they need reasonable adjustment, and by outlining what the process involves during that interview structure. So if you were operating in a market or an industry where that was prevalent, then my recommendation would be in the interview invite for a video interview, you would call out that the stage of the process requires you to submit a written response and 4 video interview questions that are going to require you to think about what you've written, for instance, and then ask for any, if the candidate would like any reasonable adjustment made to cater for their own set of circumstances to be considered in line with other applicants. We're finding candidates are becoming a lot more forthcoming with their situation, which is fabulous to see, and particularly organisations who do hold that in high regard are being seen in a much more positive light because of their inclusivity and belonging efforts. So that would be my recommendation in terms of English as a second language and those that have any disability with or challenge in providing a written response. One comment I will actually make there is one of our cherished organisation clients use us here and in China. And given that our platform is language agnostic, any character or letter that you can type on your keyboard, you can have that in our platform. That they will test for bilingual capability. So the first 3 questions will be asked in English and asking the candidates to respond in English. And then the next set of questions will be in Mandarin and asking the candidates to respond in Mandarin. And so particularly for those candidates who have checked a genuine bilingual capability, you soon start to see who have the genuine bilingual versus fluent in both languages versus more skilled at one language than another.
Thank you, Jane. Just 2 more questions before we sign off. The first one is, how do you get hiring managers on board to understand bias?
That is the $64 million question. Jo will answer, Dr. Jo will answer, and then I'd love to see if you have any views on this. But I think the way that I've seen organisations get hiring managers on board is not to couch this in interview training skills, because everybody, particularly with one of the biases, I can't remember the name of it, I'll find it in a minute, but about people overestimate their own abilities, and everyone thinks that they're a fabulous interviewer or a fabulous driver, or they overestimate their own capability. So I first of all wouldn't couch unconscious bias training in interview skills training, but rather host some mini sessions or even micro learning sessions in a fun or gamification or quiz-like manner to test your own biases. So you think you don't have biases? Great. Let's have a look at the IAT test, for instance, would be one way. The other way, I mean, it's about change really, and about recognising that you have biases and recognising when you have the opportunity to make behavioural change is the first step to getting on that behavioural change. And kind of as a bit of a sidebar story in organisational or human change, there's a great Australian professor, his name escapes me at the moment, but done some great research, leading research on, even when people are given, have a terminal illness and given the opportunity to make behavioural change, 98% of people still don't make that change. Because people don't like change. They don't like to be changed. They don't mind change. They don't like to be changed. And so by not trying to force change on somebody, but helping them arrive at their own level of analysis on where they sit on their view on biases and implicit biases, and taking them on a bit of a journey is probably the road that I would start with. But Dr. Jo, what would you recommend?
Oh, I love everything that you said there, Jane. So I think that you're right. I think having a broader conversation within an organisation about bias is a great place to start. And I think for me, and I think it's a great question, because I can imagine that there will be resistance around this for some people, because like you said, you know, on average, most people think they're above average. So it makes it very difficult when we all think we're above average, someone's not. And particularly when it comes to that intuitive thing around interviewing, which people often kind of go, I'll go off the gut feeling here and see what that's going to look like. So I think those are some of sort of the challenges there, and having those conversations. I think where I've seen organisations do it well and to be open to change, and like you said, change is an issue for a lot of people, is those organisations that have what I would call a performance mindset. And I differentiate a performance mindset from a fixed mindset. Some people talk about fixed and growth mindsets. We're essentially talking about the same thing, but I guess because I come from a performance space, I like the notion of a performance mindset because it allows you to ask those possibility questions. What if we did it differently? What if the way we're doing it isn't as good as it could be? What if we could improve in this? And I think those sorts of questions, and if I was coming up against someone who was resistant to it, if you're familiar with any of the tools of sort of motivational interviewing, and I can make some links available for that in the materials that will go out after this as well, how you ask those conversations. So it might be, let's say, Jane, if I was butting heads with you about this, I might say, okay, Jane, well, I understand your reservations and your concerns, and I'm wondering if we considered, and so you kind of roll with the resistance rather than have a disagreement about it. But I think it's a great question. And then I think the other thing that I've seen work, and it's not normally my preferred place to start, but sometimes if I need to engender change, I would get some firmer stats around what we were starting to talk about before, which is the economic bottom line of this. I mean, the reality is we want diversity in our workplaces because we want a more inclusive workplace, but it makes financial sense to do it as well. And I think there's some people who will respond to that. And so I think that if you can go in with some of that data as well, that can be helpful.
I think so. And I think I wouldn't mind just spending a little bit of time. There was another research paper that was put out by, I think it was Accenture. And they looked at, and I'll put this in the link as well for people, but they looked at asking leaders who don't have targets in place around building a more inclusive environment, but who thought they should have that, what was limiting their organisations to the ability to set those targets. And staggeringly, the number was something like 73, 75% of respondents to the Accenture survey said they could actually be convinced to put something in, but it was that leaders didn't believe it was important, that they said it was hard to link business performance, and that they had other business priorities. So by being able to kind of hard code and put numbers again, what gets measured gets done, as most of us know. So by being able to put some hard measures around that is probably not a bad place to start. Yeah. But also, one other thing I might mention is with hiring managers, again, making it fun by perhaps taking them into, if you were using the Alchemy Interactive platform, taking them into the platform, pulling up a job that you had finalised, and then hiding some of those measures, and then asking them to go through and assess and see if they found the candidate that actually ultimately got the job and is performing well in that job 3 months later. It just starts a conversation, as you say, Dr. Jo.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Dr. Jo. And just the last question as well is, there's lots of great advice there for interviewers, but what advice can you give to the actual applicants?
Oh, that's a good one.
That is a good one. Well, Can I start, Jane? And then I don't know.
Oh, please. Please. Yeah.
Only because I'm possibly going to reveal a little bit too much about myself by answering this one. But if I was an applicant at the moment in the job market and I was trying to get a job with what I know now, like I certainly did not know this when I was that graduate that rocked up as a young female non-Catholic psychologist who did not tick a single box. But if I'd be smarter about it now. So if I was an applicant right now and I knew that I was coming to, say, Jane's organisation for an interview or whatever, well, that wouldn't work so well because Jane would use a platform. But let's say I go to another organisation, I go to an organisation for an interview. I would be finding out as much as I could about those people on that panel. I would be dressing in the corporate colours of the organisation if it was a corporate job.
Oh, that's a great one.
Do you know, a few years ago, I was fortunate enough, I was interviewed to give a TED talk, which I was able to do. I wore red, white and black to that interview. I was so, I do it with the Army. I did my first session yesterday of the course that we do, and I walk in as a civilian, not looking at all like the soldiers. I own one green shirt. I wear it the first session every single time. It's as close as I get. Maybe I need a camouflage shirt. Can I tell you, I also did it recently. So, you know, I say I haven't been for a job interview for years. I go for job interviews all the time. You know, there might even be someone watching now who's sussing me out in some way, shape or form. So I think all of us are always being evaluated for potential things. And I did during this time of COVID, here I'm sitting in my study at home to do this today. And I was having a conversation with someone. It wasn't an interview, but I was lobbying to get some work through that process. Now, this is where I reveal a bit about myself. I'd stalked this person on social media and I knew this person was a cyclist and I'm a triathlete. So what I actually did, and I did it deliberately, I haven't done it for this interview, but over my shoulder, I had sitting in the back of the screen, and you can't see it from here, it's actually just right there, the back wheel of my bike. And I just put it so it was just in shot. And it was interesting because 20 minutes into it, the fellow that I was talking to said, "Joe, I'm so sorry, I've got to ask, is that a Canyon bike in the background there?" And I went, "Oh, yes, it is. Oh, can you see that?" I said, you know, I really hope he hasn't logged in to watch this call, but anyway, I've just revealed myself. But we go to same. If we know these things about biases about people, if I'm going in as an applicant, I'm 100% going to use whatever opportunity about that. So if I was an applicant, I'd be looking up some information about biases. What are, if anyone here on the call who's in Queensland, you know, well, we're a bit similar. And if you're in North Queensland, well, you know, we're almost family. You know, we gravitate to what we know. And in the competitive market of an interview, I would be doing all of that. I don't know what that says about me, but I'll think about that afterwards and decide whether or not I regret that I just said all of those things.
No, not at all. But it's just, I love the tension that we've got here because we're fighting against that. So, because I think they're great tips for applicants, absolutely. And everything that you've just said there, Dr. Joe, would be that's a fantastic example for talent acquisition managers and specialists and HR specialists on the call today to use that as an example to say, let's stage some of those interventions along the way of the pre-screening and evaluation phase to call out, here's something that if you see something in that candidate's screen that you identify with, there's a little light that goes off in your head to say check for biases. So that was a great example. Thanks for sharing that. But I like the tip.